At Pentecost of 1184, Baldwin went to Mainz to gain his inheritance, since the imperial court was there for the celebration of Pentecost. Baldwin asked Count Philip to send envoys to ask about Baldwin's inheritance, completely unaware that Philip was actually hating him or disliked him at the moment. Remember, Philip was told falsely that Baldwin was sealing an alliance with King Philip behind his back before he left. Come to think of it, though, why else would he have gone to the king if not to make an alliance? Don't forget the aspect of propaganda that medieval sources can be. That's not the modern pejorative sense that that word carries, but just remember these authors are writing with very specific goals in mind, and we're trying to please very specific people or make them look good, specifically our chronicler Gislebert with Baldwin the Count. Baldwin set off with his finest knights and best garments and brought silver vessels and arrived at Mainz. On account of the estimated 70,000 people there, everyone was ordered to set up tents in the meadow on the other side of the Rhine, and the tents of Hainaut were some of the best-looking ones there. On Pentecost, the emperor and empress wore their crowns, and the emperor's sword was borne in the ceremony, not by the much more powerful princes that had been there who claimed it, but Frederick chose our very own Baldwin to do the honors. On Pentecost Monday, Frederick's sons were knighted, and the nobles and lords gave to the jesters and the poorer knights gold and silver generously. After breakfast on Monday and Tuesday there were jousts, but without much fighting, just usually carrying shields, spears, and banners to show off and race their horses. In the tournament, Baldwin carried Emperor Frederick's spear for him. On Tuesday night there was a huge wind that knocked down the chapel and blew over many of the tents, killing some men. During all this, Baldwin spoke to Emperor Frederick about Namur, which Duke Berthold of Thüringen had a pretty much equal claim to, minus the former promises between Henry the Blind and Baldwin IV that were renewed by Baldwin V. Baldwin said he was willing to give 1,600 marks of silver to the Duke within 8 months to have the county. Frederick told him not to do it, though, because Duke Berthold was already a weak old man and would die before Henry the Blind anyways, and he was right because he died in 1186. At the court of 1184, Frederick confirmed Baldwin's inheritance of all outlets and fiefs of the Count of Namur, and it was included in an ordinance of Gislebert and Mons himself, who writes himself into the narrative, maybe being present at this gathering of Pentecost. Among the other ones in the story, he was an eyewitness to this event as the Count's clerk. In the meantime, King Philip and Count Philip of Flanders had met again between Compiègne and Choisy to make a peace between themselves. They each picked some guarantors, as was standard for medieval peaces and treaties, to tie their men into it and make sure they kept their end of the deal. The Count of Flanders chose Count Stephen, and the king cunningly and wisely chose Baldwin of Hainaut, who did not even know of his own inclusion, being away in Germany in Mainz at the time, to try to put a wedge between Baldwin and Philip and get Baldwin on his side. So Philip basically did nothing about it and was hostile towards Baldwin, and when Baldwin returned from Mainz he found out about all of this, but Philip refused to either meet with Baldwin on the border of their lands or to have Baldwin meet him in his own territory. For this perceived betrayal of faith from Baldwin, Philip worked to get a wife. He sent some knights and abbots to Portugal, where they brought back Matilda, the sister of the King of Portugal, and some gifts. Philip endowed her with many towns, some of them being the towns of Artois, that were to be inherited by Isabella of France when he died. Since Baldwin was to inherit Flanders, he even gave her towns there like Bruges and Ghent. He was being very petty at this point, trying to stick it to Baldwin for having done some kind of betrayal by taking away his own inheritance that he was supposed to get. And in the case that he would actually have a son with Matilda, that he would get basically nothing at all. By August of 1184, Godfrey of Louvain had returned from Jerusalem, so the truce was running out concerning the conflict over Lembeck. Baldwin decided to go find the Count Philip while he was preparing for his war against King Philip. When Baldwin showed up, Philip had a conflicted look on his face, the tension in the room palpable. Baldwin asked for help against Count Godfrey of Louvain concerning Lembeck, but Count Philip, looking for excuses, told him to make a truce and help him against King Philip, with whom Baldwin had, as we said, made peace before going to Mainz. Baldwin gave him a choice. If you immediately attack the King of France, I will help you. But if you do not, you need to help me against Godfrey. This initial conversation, of course, came to nothing. The next day, they had a meeting with their men in audience. Philip asked in front of everyone if Baldwin was still going to remain in that truce with King Philip, to which Baldwin answered that he didn't want to talk about it, but was offering direct and immediate help against the king. Again, it came to nothing. The next day, on the Feast of St. Peter, Baldwin found his army assembled at Tubize, including Bishop Roger of Laon, his cousin, the Count of Rethel, Raoul of Coucy, and some other nobles with their contingents. The following day, Jacques d'Avesne told Baldwin that the Count of Flanders was at the aid of the Count Godfrey and would help him in battle. So Baldwin heeded this information to contact the Count of Louvain. At this point we can start calling him the Duke of Brabant, which came into use at around this time. Jacques d'Avesne was sent to talk to the Duke, but while he was returning to Baldwin, he took longer than he should have, and the Duke burned Lembec, with the help of Wavrin, the steward of Flanders, and his 300 knights and other soldiers. Disorganized, Baldwin's men charged toward the opponent, but Baldwin only let a few cross a certain river to go to the enemy, not wanting to fully engage and to preserve any alliance he could still have with Count Philip. Still, there was a battle where 80 knights of Hainaut died, and 340 of Brabant, and some of Count Philip's men were captured. Again, for the purposes of this video, don't forget that the numbers for these statistics can be quite elevated. It probably wasn't 80 and 340. It could have been, but it probably wasn't that high. The next day, Jacques d'Avesne, who was blamed for the burning of Lembec by having delayed his return, mediated and the two sides made a peace. So Baldwin released his men from their pledges to help in the conflict, paid the mercenaries he had hired, and sent everyone home. Baldwin then went to Paris with some men and made a peace with King Philip against Count Philip. Count Philip, hearing this, got his army together to fight Baldwin. Jacques d'Avesne, Baldwin's former rebellious vassal turned liegeman for the castle of Mons and for some land in Valenciennes, switched sides to Count Philip. He also held a few more castles, Avesnes, Landrecies, and Luz. Previously, after the Condé incident, the preceding fall, Jacques had gone to the chapel of Baldwin Mons, and before his peers, both of Mons and Valenciennes, did homage for these with the oath and kiss of peace. He promised to do garrison service at these castles when there would be a war with the Count of Flanders, and that, in such an event, he would give up his castles that he held from the Count. The war began on All Saints' Day, or November 1st, less than 40 days after the oath, so that meant he could still betray that promise, and he did, giving up Avesnes, Landrecies, and Luz to Count Philip. Count Philip fortified his border with France, then marched on Hainaut with 500 knights, 1,000 mounted knights with chainmail, and 40 foot soldiers, coming through Cambrai in the southwest of Hainaut. At the start of the war, Count Philip conquered some castles, not arming them, and another settlement that had no fortified value. Baldwin even burned some areas so Philip could not supply himself in those areas. Then the Archbishop of Cologne, also named Philip, came into the area with 1,300 knights and mounted sergeants from the east. Duke Godfrey of Brabant and his son Henry came too against Baldwin with 400 knights and supposedly 60,000 men. All three met up at some point around Maubeuge. All this time, Baldwin was busy fortifying his castles, so he wasn't yet engaging his enemies directly. He upgraded fortifications or dug ditches, stuffed each with more knights, and ordered his vassals to do the same, and notably put 140 knights as well as some crossbowmen at the castle of Mons, where his sister was in childbirth. Gislebert says Baldwin had at his disposal 300 mercenary knights, 3,000 mercenary sergeants, and 300 auxiliary knights from abroad. In addition to his own knights and men, he attributes to Baldwin this harangue: "Take comfort and be strong, because our enemies will withdraw at some time, and leave our lands to us, because they cannot take the lands with them." Money thieves are becoming more common at this time, as are mercenaries in the money economy that had been brewing for the last maybe 150 years, and starting to reach new heights here. Flanders and its surrounding areas were known for their mercenaries for hire, called the Brabançons, who fought in events like the Catholic Crusade, for example, much to the dismay of the church that didn't agree with hiring soldiers. Specifically, Baldwin was enfeoffing knights by giving them money and towns to live in and protect. Some received a few dozen pounds of silver, like some knights from France that were enfeoffed in Hainaut. Others, notably the famed Baldwin Caron, who had defected from Philip of Flanders over a dispute, received a fief of 600 pounds of silver and a town near Valenciennes, being the highest mentioned. This allowed for more freedom of the lord, namely Baldwin, to give fiefs without giving up land that could make disputes. Instead, he could just pay with the high amounts of silver circulating at that time. The value of the knight could be determined not only by his courage, but by his perceived power and usefulness, which is why some would receive more pay than others. The war did not last long. Baldwin and Philip, the Archbishop of Cologne, had a meeting through middlemen, and the Archbishop was telling Baldwin to desist and make peace. Baldwin played it clever, though, knowing the enemy was low on supplies, and pretended to be wishy-washy for 3 days until Count Philip, Archbishop Philip, and Duke Godfrey realized it and went back to their lands. On the way out, Philip of Flanders kept attacking castles, much to his detriment, as Gislebert reports, even using crossbowmen and siege machines called mangonels, which threw stones. In the war, Baldwin had sent his 3 sons to the castle of Toulon of the Bishop of Liège for safekeeping. As the bishop's liege man, Baldwin asked for assistance in the war, but received none. King Philip was supposed to help too and had some men set up at Compiègne for just that, but they ended up turning a different direction to fight Stephen of Champagne instead. When the dust settled, Jacques de Vesna had the audacity to say he had not gone against his fidelity to the Count of Hainaut in all of this, and that the matter should be tried in a French or English court, which had begun to be much more robust at this period, or otherwise be decided by a duel. The war was ended by a truce a few days before Christmas, and negotiations lasted beyond Epiphany, and Baldwin rewarded his men for their service toward him. During this time, Baldwin and Philip of Flanders went to a meeting with King Philip between Compiègne and Choisy during the 8 days of Christmas. In the truces made, Jacques de Vesna was included by Philip of Flanders, so when Eustache the Younger of Le Wilx and Odo of Trasigny took up Jacques' offer for a duel that he had gave to prove his innocence and loyalty to Baldwin, Philip refused the idea to protect him. Baldwin told everyone he should honor his word and do it, but Jacques kept hiding by the truces unnobly, as Gislebert let us know. Baldwin rewarded some of his knights with strategic marriages too, like the aforementioned Baldwin Caron, who had defected from Philip. Another defector was rewarded, Goswin Wavrin, who had killed one of Philip's men. The Wavrin held the position of steward of the Count of Flanders, but they had sort of gotten on the Count's bad side because one of their own was the one who was having an affair with Elizabeth of Vermandois, Philip's wife, the one who was hung by his parts in a latrine until he died because of it. After Easter of 1185, a new conflict began, quite a yearly occurrence as you can tell. The Castellan of Peronne, holding the castle of Bray too from Philip of Flanders, handed it over to King Philip instead, receiving it from him as a fief. The king put knights in Bray, and then both sides brought troops to the town of Beauvais, on either side of the river. According to Gislebert, and this should be an exaggeration, Philip II brought 2,000 knights and 140,000 men, both mounted and unmounted, and Philip the Count brought 400 knights and 40,000 others, being limited because he had garrisoned his castles against Baldwin and because he needed to guard his frontiers. Plus, the lords on the march with France would not leave their lands undefended, so they stayed back to defend there instead. Baldwin, meanwhile, had been pillaging Jacques of Avesne's land, burning 110 towns when he received a message from King Philip asking him to come to his side at Beauvais, even though there were already peace talks beginning to be discussed. Baldwin went there, even though he wanted to obliterate more towns of the Count of Flanders and of the Lord of Avesne. The Treaty of Beauvais in 1185 is an important part of the French Franco-Flemish history. It said that Count Philip would give back Eleanor Vermandoise's inheritance to the king. He would also give to the king various lands like Amiens, Montdidier, Toulouse, Choisy, and Beauvais, among others. Baldwin would receive the 500 pounds of silver of revenue again from Philip that he had gotten in exchange for giving back his marriage dowry of Douai. Baldwin and Count Philip would be on good terms again, and Jacques of Avesne would re-enter liege homage to Baldwin. Noyon, Montreuil-sur-Mer, and Saint-Riquier were acquired by the King of France, including Corbie, which had been, as we said, given to Baldwin V of Flanders over a century prior as a dowry from the Capetian family. The treaty also had the mediation of William, Archbishop of France, like a lot of the king's administration up until a certain point, and of Thibaut of Champagne. From Eleanor of Champagne in the peace, Philip received Amiens and 65 castles. The treaty was a total disgrace to the Count of Flanders and emboldened the King of France, as both parties said. Philip II, the king, pleaded, it is said, this might be a bit strong, for Baldwin to accept the peace, and he did not really gaining anything other than the suffering of his rival Philip. Homages were re-rendered, and King Philip gave Jacques of Avesne a secret fief of 100 pounds of land from the king. This is a fief rent, one of many in the region of Flanders, Hainaut, Namur, Brabant, to sway the lords and knights. They had already been thrown around in the region by Angevin counts as well, but they were going to ramp up at this point, with Richard and especially King John first, then King Philip, and John even more after Philip had gotten involved. After the war, in 1185, Baldwin had the walls of Mons and Binche elevated, ramparts added to the former with a rebuilt tower and a better ditch around it, even at the expense of neighboring houses that had to be removed. He built a ditch at Valenciennes, a wall around his manor at Ath, and raised some more walls and built more towers in some cities. It is said he did this because he only trusted a few men, which is reasonable after the whole debacle with Count Philip and Jacques of Avesne. After peace, Duke Godfrey of Brabant and his son Henry attacked Namur. Baldwin just could not get a break, could he? Baldwin brought 300 knights and apparently 30,000 men to Namur, carefully not attacking Brabant directly in order to not betray the truces he just made between himself and the Duke there. His uncle Henry the Blind had 200 knights and 10,000 men. The Duke held himself up in Gembloux, where Baldwin and Henry the Blind, after much fighting, took over, destroying the town, getting revenge on the enemy of Baldwin. Count Philip then went to Spire, where Henry, son of Frederick Barbarossa and king of the Romans, was in August of that year, 1185. Henry told him he was surprised he didn't ask for help before against his enemy, the King of France. He promised to help him against the king, maybe to charge through Lotharingia, which meant charging through and laying waste to Baldwin's Hainaut. King Philip then summoned Count Philip to come to him in a meeting to give him a new castle of Beauquesne in Amiens, but Philip didn't go because he was awaiting Henry's help. So Henry, Godfrey of Brabant, the Archbishop of Cologne, and Count Philip went to Liège to meet up and talk about plans for that fall. They invited Baldwin too, and he went with 200 knights, but stopped at Andenne since he didn't have a safe conduct. He was given an escort of the Bishop of Liège, Raoul, and the Archbishop of Cologne, the Count Palatinate of the Rhine, Duke Henry of Limbourg, and Count Albert of Dasbourg. At the destination, Henry, the King of the Romans, told Baldwin to help against King Philip, and he did not recognize he was supposed to help Philip by their alliance, but he called out Count Philip for betraying his own liege lord despite the peace made. Baldwin left undismayed, but did say he would do what his liege lord, the Bishop of Liège, said. That November, King and Count Philip made the Treaty of Aumale, without the consent of Henry, King of the Romans. Henry the Blind, at the instigation of the Archbishop of Cologne and the Duke of Brabant, married the Count of Gelder's sister, and they had a daughter the following July, 1186. You can imagine how this made Baldwin feel, another aging ally who got married threatening his inheritance. During Lent, 1185, King Philip met with his Champenois family and invited Baldwin to come with him to reaffirm the former marriage agreements. This was more urgent now because his next daughter Yolande was old enough to marry, the also old enough Henry of Champagne. Baldwin asked for a delay since he was still a little young, so instead his son, the 14-year-old Baldwin, married the 12-year-old Marie de Champagne. Gislebert reports about the couple that he was a virtuous knight and loved her alone, while she dedicated herself to a holy lifestyle, including the divine office as well as almsgiving. As for Yolande, it was sworn by all that she would marry Henry of Champagne as soon as she came of age. Around that time, Count Philip and Count Baldwin met with King Philip and King Henry II. Count Philip, in recompense for receiving the town of Beauquesne from the king, gave King Philip the town of Roye before he went off to visit with the emperor. He also reaffirmed his new Portuguese wife Matilda's possessions she gained in Flanders from her marriage. It's like the opposite of a dowry. I forgot what it's called. You can imagine how Baldwin felt when he saw his future possible inheritance being dished out to some Portuguese queen. In 1186, at Easter time, Baldwin got all his clerks and secretaries together at his castle of Mons to record the expenses spent during the wars with Philip II. Philip, Godfrey of Louvain, Brabant, and Jacques de Vesna, and they calculated it to be about 41,000 pounds of Valenciennes silver. So to pay most of it off, Baldwin started taxing his people more. In July 1186, there was a massive storm that did a lot of tree and crop and animal damage, and Eustache, the younger of the Rilks, died, to the sadness of many, including Baldwin, who was his third cousin or something close to that. On the way back, Baldwin happened to be present when the relics under the altar, apparently put there by Queen Clotilde, Clovis's wife, like the top of the head of Saint Denis and a lock of St. Mary's hair, were taken out and examined. Around Easter 1187, Henry the Blind of Namur and Luxembourg promised his less than 1-year-old daughter to Henry of Champagne, the one Yolande of Hainaut was supposed to actually marry, which broke the old marriage contract many times renewed between Hainaut and Champagne, promising to the Count of Champagne all of his fiefs and adlibs of Namur. So Baldwin sent Lambert, abbot of Saint-Gislain, and our narrator, Gislebert, to Emperor Frederick at Toul in Lotharingia to ask him if this was reasonable. He told him that Namur would be fully given to Baldwin after Henry's death, and that he would not allow it to go into the hands of the Count of Champagne, possibly because of Henry's relation to King Philip. Baldwin was also quite favorable to the emperor, as we have already seen. The valor of the knights of the area of Hainaut was renowned all over Europe. In July of 1187, King Philip went to Aquitaine against Richard the Lionheart, and Baldwin had gone with him with 110 knights and 80 mounted sergeants, all the knights and many of the sergeants equipped better than others in the army of King Philip, because Baldwin's horses were in iron armor. Baldwin was thus given the privilege of the first battle over Philip of Flanders and Henry of Champagne, who were also there at the campaign. The battle was, of course, like all battles at this time, essentially a tournament struggle. This is before the stereotypical 1v1 horse joust from the later Middle Ages. At this time, battles were seen as tournaments, and tournaments were seen as battles. If you look at the historiography of the 1214 Battle of Bouvines, for example, multiple sources call the battle a tournament. Instead, the peace was negotiated largely by Richard, but also by the papal legate Octavian, who was more interested in a crusade in the Middle East than by pitched battles between Christian powers. After this, Baldwin went to Namur to tell Henry the Blind that he needed to honor the inheritance agreement with him, that he had violated by shoving his daughter into the marriage agreement that Baldwin's daughter was already signed up for. Still, Henry's men gave their pledges, it is said by either fear or money, to Henry of Champagne in support of the marriage of his son to their count's daughter. Emperor Frederick was in Worms at this time to meet with his princes, notably with his rival, Archbishop Philip of Cologne, in August on the Assumption. So Baldwin sent a knight, Goswin of Toulon, and Gislebert, our author, to plead Baldwin's case, even showing the records with the Count of Nemours' seal as proof. Gislebert, who was present at the assembly, said that the princes were all astonished at the treachery, that the Duke of Nemours and Luxembourg would betray his nephew Baldwin, who had helped him so many times against his enemies in Brabant and Flanders. The son of Godfrey of Brabant, brother of the young Henry, who was Archdeacon of Liège, left his office there and went to Baldwin to be knighted on October 28th. Henry of Hainaut was sent at this time to preach the Third Crusade to the French and Germans after Saladin had a major success. Advent 1187, there was a meeting between King Philip and Frederick near Chiny. Both invited Baldwin, but he went with Frederick on account of being an imperial subject. Ultimately, the emperor told Baldwin to wait until his son Henry came back from Italy to go over land guarantees and that sort of thing. So he went back home, spent Christmas at Binche, and went to Valenciennes to receive Philip II in a meeting. After a few days, Philip II went to Tournai from Valenciennes in the safety of Baldwin's lands, which was unprecedented since those in Tournai had only ever obeyed their bishop. This is when King Philip gave them a commune to extend his royal control in such a region festering with independence and allegiance switching, as we've seen with Count Philip. The commune established, rights guaranteed by royal hand or by royal steel. Now the bishop more or less controlled the lands outside of the city, but only the spiritual prerogatives inside the city. Around then, Henry of Hainaut, who was preaching the Third Crusade, came to Mons and stayed for 2 days, honorably lodged in the castle of Mons. He said divine hours in the Church of Blessed Vaudreuil. Otto of Trasigny, among other knights, decided to take up the cross. Henry then went to Brabant, where Henry the Young, the Duke, said he would too, but then he went back on that and did war on his neighbors instead. Then this cardinal, Henry of Hainaut, went to Liège to rag on the bishop for the rampant simony in his diocese. So he preached there about the crusade against simony and began directing the diocese how he could, which the bishop opposed, not being one to hear criticism. A few councils were set up, which had over 2,000 clerks, priests, deacons, and others, the Bishop of Raoul of Liège, the Cardinal Henry of Hainaut, and just one layman, our Count Baldwin. The cardinal took away many of their prebends and possessions and then gave them to others instead, and forgave them all for their simony, accompanied by penances. Another chronicler, Gilles of Orval, in his Justa Episcoporum Leonensium, says the clerks were overcome with sorrow for their sin, and freely gave up their prebends to the cardinal, who moved them around, and even wept over it. Albert, that former Archdeacon of Liège and son of Godfrey of Brabant, who had left that life to become a knight, returned at this meeting and was marked with the cross there, which meant he intended to go on crusade, which was undoubtedly still an affair of business of Henry of Hainaut while in Liège. Then Henry of Hainaut went to Mainz, where the emperor and his princes were. Frederick and his son Frederick of Swabia took the cross. At a meeting in France near Gisors on January 21st, 1188, Philip II, Richard the Lionheart, the Count of Flanders, Counts Thibaut and Stephen, Count Raoul of Clermont, and others, took the cross too, each picking their respective color cross to wear for their country, like red for France, white for England, and green for Flanders. By this time, word reached Baldwin that Henry, son of Emperor Frederick, had returned from Italy to Germany at Ingelheim, so he made plans to go see him and plead his case about Namur, that if you remember, Frederick told him to wait until Henry was back before settling anything. On the way, Henry of Namur tried to flatter Baldwin, but Baldwin just didn't trust it, so he kept pushing to Germany. Once there, both emperor and son confirmed his inheritance of Namur, which would stand above any unfair usurpation because of some illicit marriage. When Baldwin returned to Hainaut, he met with Henry of Namur, who agreed to the settlement by the emperor and made his burgesses, knights, and other men, as well as himself, swear to this over relics. When Baldwin returned home, he found a feud between two of his subjects. Gerard of Saint-Aubert, one of Baldwin's men, said that a man called Robert of Beaurain was his vassal or serf, which Robert firmly denied. They both gave to Count Baldwin a pledge, which consisted of an object to be given to him, showing their desire to fight out their disagreement in a duel. which was something even serfs could do, if he was in fact a serf. On the set day, Girard showed up ready to fight, but Robert was still at Mons until the 9th hour, which was the deadline for the fight, so Baldwin declared Girard the Lord of Robert. Girard immediately put him in chains when he showed up and dragged him to his property, where he asked for mercy and received some consolation. Robert then ran off to Henry of Nemours to seek help, where incidentally a similar thing had happened, where one of Henry's knights claimed another was a serf, and the supposed serf not showing up to the 5th day of Christmas for a duel at the 9th hour of the day, and thus being deprived of his own lands. While Baldwin was in Nemours, he settled scores among the unruly knights and castellans who were always involved in feuds with one another, and with their duke. This made Duke Henry's men angry, who called on the Duke of Champagne for help, who had a growing interest in Nemours. The Duke of Champagne told Henry, the Duke, that if he let Baldwin stay in his lands, he might see his lands taken over. On one case of justice was when a merchant came to Baldwin and told him that a man had robbed and beaten him, so Baldwin had that man found and burned alive. The men of Duke Henry, loyal to him only and not at all to Baldwin despite their oaths, tried to skew it to make it seem like an evil punishment or encroachment on his lands, which it was in Nemours, but Baldwin was seemingly overstepping his jurisdiction here. Duke Henry then became very sick, so Baldwin went to visit him at his palace. Before he got there, Henry sent an envoy to Baldwin telling him to stay away because his very presence displeased him. Baldwin insisted on going and seeing him, though, so he took some knights with him and was met with 60 of those of Henry. They went to his bedside. There, Baldwin asked to be released from any fealty to his uncle from their previous alliances, and Henry agreed, so Baldwin returned home. Then Baldwin attacked Nemours and pillaged. Some knights countered Baldwin, and he was able to capture a few and make them swear to not counter him again. He captured the leper Count Gilles of Duras and held on to him for a while. Gislebert says Baldwin was upset with the looting his men had done of gold, silver, fabrics, and decorations because the townspeople loved him, and he didn't want to antagonize them, but he knew it could not be prevented. Baldwin's men captured the city of Nemours and besieged the castle. Henry's men set fire to the city and offered the castle to be given to both Baldwin and his liege man Roger of Condé. When Henry sent some knights from the Count of Champagne in the castle and ordered Roger to give it back to him, Baldwin's men took it and gave it to Baldwin, who stocked it with supplies and knights. Baldwin then had King Philip call him to a meeting, but he was scared because the Count of Champagne had to cut his campaign with the king short due to Baldwin's attacks on his men stationed in Nemours with their ally Henry, assumedly because of pushing the Count of Champagne to return and help his ally, the Henry of Nemours. King Philip was mad at Baldwin, and apparently also Emperor Henry and Frederick, for whatever reason, despite being a favored vassal. Also, Count Philip of Flanders was against him, Henry of Nemours, and Henry of Brabant, and the Archbishop of Cologne, so it is said Baldwin had, at this point, he had no allies besides his own men. Still in Henry of Nemours' land, Baldwin had been ordered by the abbot of Floref to get his men out of there, and promised by the abbot nothing would happen, but as soon as his men left, Henry of Nemours entered, and the monks were dispersed in the chaos. Our chronicle tells us here in this conflict of the exploit of a knight named John Cornutus, who was jumped by about 40 of Henry's men with just a couple knights and sergeants by his side. When John and his convoy attacked them, they fled, so he brought his horse to a cliff and jumped an impressive distance into their boat, sinking it and killing many and capturing others. Whether this really happened or not, it just shows the idea that horses were extremely well trained to follow their rider's command. Baldwin and his wife Margaret, still in the meantime, went to Count Philip and asked for an alliance. He said he would only have Baldwin's alliance if Baldwin gave him some castles that he technically held in Aled from the Bishop of Cambrai. He would also have to be a loyal man of Philip in a way that would make him liable to summons to duel. He said no when they went home, not wanting to make himself subject of another count. So Baldwin sent out 2 envoys. One went to King Henry, who was at Frankfurt am Main, to justify that Baldwin took those castles because his inheritance was in danger. He set up a meeting for him in Saxony with Frederick to receive anything as an imperial aled or fief from them and to get advice on other affairs. The Count of Toul at this time had been sent by Henry to try to bribe the German leaders with money about Nemours on behalf of the Count of Troyes, but he was scorned and sent away. Baldwin sent more envoys to the king and emperor because he felt too in danger to go himself to them. They gave Baldwin their favor for a price of 1,550 marks to be paid in 3 installations at Christmas, Easter, and at either the death of Henry of Nemours or whenever they made an agreement. He would meet with them and receive Nemours from their hands, becoming an imperial prince. So Baldwin and Henry and Godfrey of Louvain/Brabant made a truce, but the latter two broke it. So Baldwin went personally to meet with the king of the Romans, who was at Worms, getting safe passage from lords along the way. There at Worms, the king combined all the fiefs and aleds and gave them to Baldwin as a march, now a margrave of Nemours, which was now a margraviate. Henry told him to be quiet about it until either Henry of Namur died or some agreement could be made. As part of the agreement, any descendant of Baldwin who held Hainaut could hold the Margravate of Namur. Emperor Henry planned a meeting at Liège, the 8th day of Epiphany between Baldwin and both Henrys, of Namur and Brabant. Since they could not come to an agreement, he took Baldwin and Henry of Namur with him to Maastricht for more talks, which also led to nothing, but the king of the Romans realized now that what Baldwin meant specifically by the incapacity of Henry of Namur, who seemed rather deficient in negotiations or just in general. Finally, he brought them to the Kaiserswerth and made a peace between them. Godfrey of Brabant agreed to give to Baldwin the lands he held from Namur and Champagne for 5,000 marks, and they promised to help each other except against the Bishop of Liège, the Count of Flanders, Henry, or Frederick. Both parties sealed each other's agreement in writing, and Godfrey would renounce Henry of Namur, and that Godfrey would hold whatever lands he held from Henry of Namur from Baldwin instead. And Baldwin left his son, Baldwin, with the King Henry to learn German, since he would need it being an imperial prince. Baldwin had safe passage through the Duke of Guelders' land and had a procession from Saint-Waudru and at his return to Mons, like he had for him every time he came back from the imperial court. Baldwin let his son Baldwin, in the imperial court, be knighted by Henry at Speyer at Pentecost 1189, and Baldwin the younger gave many gifts to those around him, priests, knights, jesters, etc. Henry even asked if Baldwin would make one of his young sons a cleric and would make him, after 15 years, Archbishop of Cologne, Mainz, Trier, or Liège, which he didn't want to, and it didn't happen. Gilles, Count of Duras, who would become a leper, gave his land to his two brothers, but kept the outlet of Jourdoigne. With the permission of his kin, the Count of Flanders, Godfrey of Brabant attacked and seized it, and Gilles fought back in his illness, and took many valuables from him, and captives for a large ransom. The brothers, having no heirs, gave the land to Liège, who sold it to Luz. Then Conan of Duras, the new count, sold the advocacy of Duras and its castle to Henry of Louvain, who stocked it to harass the Count of Luz. To help his kin, in the third-ish degree of relation, Baldwin went and attacked Brabant's land, arguing Henry of Louvain had already put aside their treaty and pillaged his land, going there and back home. Baldwin put some knights in castles they took along the way, like in Namur, Braine-le-Comte, and Nivelles. In August, King Philip invited the family of Champagne and Baldwin to Pontoise to make peace. Luxembourg was to be let alone. Baldwin was to own Namur. Count Thibault was to own La Roche and Derby, but Baldwin didn't want to displease his king, so he sent Gislebert to confirm this, and Henry said he would not let Thibault own any of his lands. And Thibault did not like the peace because he wanted to sow discord between Baldwin and King Henry. The Count of Flanders decided to make a meeting with Henry of Louvain and Baldwin. Then Baldwin besieged the monastery of Florath for 7 weeks, we already talked about this monastery just a bit ago, against fearless men, and eventually pushed them out by preparing to burn the place. He knocked down the towers so they couldn't be used anymore. In June of 1190, Baldwin and Henry of Namur made negotiations. Henry's was to no longer have towns with castles in them. Baldwin to take oaths from Henry's men. This was confirmed by King Henry, who received the agreed upon money from Baldwin. Actually, it was given to the Lord Archbishop of Cologne, where Henry wanted it to go. Godfrey of Louvain then died at this point. Gislebert was then sent on mission to Henry to tell him about the aforementioned peace at September 24th, 1190 at Schwäbisch Hall. Count Philip of Flanders was the brother of the deceased Count Matthew of Boulogne, who had sort of kidnapped Mary, the heiress, from her monastery, which we may have talked about. Ida was Philip's niece, and Philip didn't let her have possession of the county, keeping it for himself. Matthew and Mary had another daughter, Matilda, who was married to Henry of Brabant, so Philip let Henry control the county here in 1190, because Philip needed money for a crusade, so Philip, having Boulogne under his thumb and needing money, gave it as security to Henry for £5,000. The next year, 1191, Baldwin V would give it back to Ida since he had succeeded to Flanders. Gislebert went to Henry to tell him of the peace, and he was very pleased. At the meeting Henry had, next with his lords, knights, and clerics, he let them all know what he had ordered with Namur, that Baldwin gave him liege homage for the Margravate. But the Duke of Louvain disagreed, saying it hurt his dignity, and used his spokesman, the Count of Flanders himself, and Henry of Louvain was claiming Namur and La Roche as his own. Gislebert argued to King Henry that the one who claims Namur should have to answer in a duel. Everyone agreed, even the Count of Flanders and the Margrave of Meissen, that Henry of Louvain had no standing there since neither he nor his ancestors had owned anything in Namur apart from what they had. King Henry told Henry of Louvain, to name all the counties he possessed, and he named Louvain, Nivelles, Archot, all of which he had held in his own right, and he named a couple counties that were held from him by Thierry IV of Cleves and Otto of Gelder, who had other possessions not from Henry. And he mentioned Luz, saying it was his because he had a pass of safe conduct there. Gerard of Luz, who had bought his county from Liège, and held it from him, and the only reason Henry of Namur had free passage in Luz was because of his ancestors killed his, and free passage for his descendants was part of the deal. King Henry agreed, and a charter privilege was given to Gislebert to give to Baldwin at the meeting at Schwäbisch Hall. Henry of Louvain went to Augsburg to convince the lords there to help him. For 9 days at Augsburg with Philip of Flanders, they pled their case, but Henry was not convinced. Gislebert returned, finding Baldwin and Margaret in Namur, and Baldwin had the diploma from the king read aloud in the monastery of Saint-Aubin to all there, and there was a procession there, then at Mons, then at Valenciennes, and there he broke his seal and made a new one, this time saying Marquis of Namur and Count of Hainaut. In 1191, Count Philip of Flanders died at Acre in the Crusade. So Philip, the king, rushed home to take his lands in Vermandois and Artois. And that is it for episode 2 of Baldwin V of Hainaut. I hope it wasn't too confusing or long or fast, that it made sense. That's all for now. Goodbye.